Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca. I am the Communications and Program Manager here at the Elections Group. I am so excited for everyone who has joined us today. For those of you maybe joining us for the first time, the Elections Group is a team of election experts supporting election professionals through collaboration, thought leadership, and elevating best practices. We've all worked in elections offices before, so we know firsthand the challenges faced by election officials. We use our real world experience to help you solve those challenges. I'm super excited about our conversation today. It is all about radio. Radio remains one of the most trusted and accessible ways to reach voters, especially those in rural areas, older populations, and folks who have different language needs. We hope that through today's discussion, election officials will learn more about how you can use radio to build trust, share information, and connect with your communities. Our goal is that folks will be able to plan, script, and place radio content that informs and builds confidence in the elections process. I am so excited about our panel today. Everyone here is wonderful. I am going to let everyone introduce themselves, but we will start with you, Pam.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I am a consultant, communication consultant with the Elections Group. But before that, I was an NPR correspondent for 28 years and a lifelong journalist. I'm now retired, but I spent a lot of time on radio.
Welcome. Next up, we have Nick Lima. Nick.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Nick Lima, I'm the Registrar Director of Elections for the City of Cranston in Rhode Island. I've been on the job here for about 9 years, since 2017. But before I was in elections, I spent 13 years as a summer college baseball broadcaster in the New England Collegiate Baseball League, including a lot of experience on radio. And even back in college, I was the general manager of my college radio station. So I've got a communications and a media background prior to my work in elections.
Very cool. It probably came in handy. And lastly, we have TJ.
Hi, everybody. I'm TJ Pache. I'm the Director of Partnerships at the Elections Group. And as is often the case, I am the least qualified person in this Zoom room, but I was previously a communications director for a county election office in Florida.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining. A few housekeeping things before we jump into the Q&A. We don't have the chat function on for the folks who are joining us today, but we do have the Q&A function on. So if you have any questions, comments, and concerns, drop them there and we will get to them during the Q&A portion of our discussion. All right, let's dive right in. So the first question that we have for you all is, why is radio important? And whoever wants to start can go ahead and take it.
Well, I guess I'll start. It's important partly because, especially for election officials, because it is probably one of the easiest and cheapest mediums to use, no matter how you use it. And it reaches so many Americans, and it reaches people in smaller communities. It reaches people, in their car. It reaches people in their homes. It reaches them wherever they are, and you can get quick messages to them. They don't have to be online. It also helps you reach more special interest groups. You might be able to reach people who have maybe Spanish-speaking stations, other groups of people that you really want to target your message at, and it's really quite wonderful and very effective.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think as election officials are thinking about their communications toolbox, radio, but also some of the skills used for communicating through radio are really important pieces of that toolbox. And I think I'd be remiss too. We know that radio, in the events of emergencies, natural disasters, it remains a kind of continuously accessible communications medium, which you can imagine. We've had colleagues in states where much of the communications infrastructure that they rely upon kind of goes away, but they've still been able to rely and use radio effectively.
And Pam really said it well, that there's different communities you can reach with radio that are tougher to break into via other mediums. So whether it's a small niche community that listens to a particular community, like radio station, or you're using a very small amount of resources, in many cases no resources at all, to reach out on a radio station that has a market of 100,000 listeners. Either way, you're connecting directly with people, and you're doing so at a minimal cost for your office. And in many cases, no cost at all, because plenty of local, especially news talk radio stations or NPR stations, they want to hear directly from stakeholders around elections time, and having an election official on to talk about the process, talk about voting hours, talk about mail ballot deadlines. That's easy to do. It's low hanging fruit for an election office to take advantage of. And it's a call you should almost, unless it's a radio station you really don't trust, or something, or a host you don't trust, it's a call you should almost always pick up, and an opportunity you should always engage in, because if not, that void is going to be filled by other people on the airwaves.
And actually, can I add one other thing? I spent the first half of my career in print, newspapers and magazine, and the second half on radio. And I can't tell you how amazing it was. Now I know it was NPR, but nationally, but the reception that I got from people all around the country, I would just meet strangers anywhere in this country, and they say, "Oh, I know you," and it was just sort of this something that radio has, that you connect with the person that you're hearing, and it just permeates so much of our society. It really was extraordinary, that connection that you get from talking on the radio to the listener. And it's something that you don't get anywhere else, not in social media, and certainly not in print.
I think those are all really good points, and we've covered a lot of kind of like the questions that I had to follow up on this. But one thing that I'm curious about is the outlook on radio. What do you all feel the outlook of radio looks like, or the future of radio? TJ, do you want to start?
I mean, I think I mentioned in my first answer, relying upon or recognizing some of the skills that go into presenting for radio, writing for radio. And I think what we've seen both in radio and in the larger media landscape is kind of this democratization of access. So you've got podcasts now that, essentially use the same form. They don't necessarily have the same timing restrictions, but you've got folks who are kind of taking those foundational pieces of communicating through radio, through their voices. And I think it's just a great way of doing that. But I also think that, election officials can do well by kind of keeping an eye on the evolution of those things. I think these webinars are a great example. Obviously, we show our faces, but you can imagine a format that's very similar to this, conversation based, that uses the same principles of radio. So I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's evolving. I think it's changing a little bit, but I think it's something that folks would do well to continue to pay attention to and learn about.
Yeah, I mean, radio is evolving. It's not just radio. There's also lots of radio-like platforms out there. Just look at high turnout, wide margins, which is listened to by many, both election officials and non-election officials around the country. I think but also by a growing number, and other similar kind of podcast type formats. But radio is still going to be here for a very long time to come. You talk about a medium that's been around for 100 years. Just like newspapers are still around. The format has changed. The number of newspapers we have has changed, but they've been around since the colonial era. They're going to continue to be around, I think, for decades in some way, shape, or form. And radio is the same way. I had people in the industry, telling me 20 years ago that, radio is going to be dying out in the next couple of years. Local talk radio, by and large, it's going to be taken over by national syndication. And a lot of that's true. A lot of that's happened. It's harder to get into some markets now because it's all syndicated, and there isn't really a local producer or a local talk show you can call up or get into their news program, because it doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to continue to evolve and change over time. But there is still going to be plenty of radio stations out there on both the FM and the AM dial. They might have lower listenership levels, but they're still there. They're still connecting with people, and it's still an opportunity to freely communicate. But the fact remains, it's an evolving and changing field. There's a reason I went to college for communications with cognates and broadcasting and journalism, but I'm working in elections now because there's not a lot of jobs left in that, especially live broadcasting field. But it is still there, it's still prevalent, and I think it's going to be there 5, 10, 15 years from now as well.
Yeah, and I would like to add, sort of as both Nick and TJ alluded to. I mean, it definitely is changing. I think you should think of it in terms of, what's the future of audio? Whether it's over broadcast radio or some other format. And I think that there will always be this demand for audio. And then separately, a number of people, have raised questions about what's going to happen with NPR, which, NPR is a national network and it has, 500 stations around the country. A lot of the local stations, I think, that election officials rely upon. What's going to happen to them now that federal funding has been eliminated? And unfortunately, I think that some of those stations will, in fact, have to shut down. But I think what's more likely to happen is that some of these smaller stations will not be able to buy the national programming, which they have to pay for, like All Things Considered and Morning Edition. But as a result, they're going to probably want more locally generated content. And actually, that's where election officials can sort of take an opportunity, I think, to help provide some of that local content. It'll be free, obviously, for the radio station, and that's the stuff that I think they're going to be looking for. So it actually, in fact, could be an opportunity for election officials.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's a great segue to my next question about content. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between placing ads. Folks can also, they also have the opportunity for PSAs and things like that on the radio. Can you guys talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of each of those and what that might look like for folks who are on this call? And Nick, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So, I mean, when it comes to ads, PSAs, I mean, obviously there can be a cost there. Depending on the radio station, that cost could be trivial, but can also be significant for election office. And for a small election office, it's just most likely not going to be in your budget. And compared to something like a newspaper ad or a website posting or even a social media ad, the bang for their buck might not be there. On a small market radio station that's going to give you a couple of plays a day for a few $100s for an ad, are you really reaching a lot of people with that ad? Versus a larger county that might have it in their budget, and they can work that out pretty well. But even then, I would recommend anyone working with radio for the first time in terms of advertising to stay on top of it. Make sure you're listening in around the time slots of those ads are supposed to run. Make sure they actually run. Be in touch with the marketing managers in case they don't, so you get a discount or some free runs, because that happens a lot, especially with automation now in radio stations and how they have everything all planned and segged out, and sometimes there are glitches and you might be paying for an ad that is not even running at all. I've seen that happen plenty of times. But it also take advantage of the free opportunities, because there are plenty of local radio talk shows that would gladly have you on for an hour. And an hour sounds like a long time to talk, but with traffic reports and weather reports and the news update and commercial breaks, we're really only talking about 35 minutes. So it goes by quickly. It's an easy way to get direct information out to voters, and obviously there's no charge to that. And same thing with with news programs, whether it's a morning drive or an afternoon drive, or a reporter for an NPR station that's going to put together a 10-minute package. Pick up the phone when they call you, or respond to those emails when they reach out to you, because again, that's just a free way to get information out there directly from your voice, from your knowledge, and not have it be repackaged, not have it be recommunicated by someone else, as will mostly happen on the TV side, or even with print journalism. You're able to express things directly as you want to your voters, and typically, whether it's a talk show host or a news reporter on a radio station, it's a lot like this kind of panel. It's they're going to ask you a question, and then they're just going to let you go for a couple minutes and explain exactly how you want to explain things in a longer format that you can't really access with other sorts of media platforms.
I'll just add, in terms of placing ads or paying for ads, as Nick alluded to, I think this is just a single tool in a bigger toolbox. I would say for communities or purposes where you really know what you're trying to get. So Pam mentioned Spanish speaking communities. So thinking about placing ads in Spanish on those radio stations, that serves a specific purpose. I always go back to poll worker recruitment. If you are a jurisdiction that struggles to recruit poll workers from certain populations that you want to tap into, figure out what they're listening to, um, pay for ads, do public service announcements, try to get in their ear through the places that you know they're going to for information. But again, recognizing that it's not a silver bullet, it's something that you need to keep an eye on, and it's something that you need to kind of adjust your approach, I think, to make sure you're being successful.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, Nick mentioned that, if a reporter from a local radio station calls you up, pick up the phone and work with them. I would also suggest, especially if you are in a market that has a radio station that has a news department, that you reach out to them first, right? That you pick up the phone, you call them, you say, hey, look, I'm running the elections office. We've got all this particular information we'd like to get out to voters over the coming months. Maybe invite a reporter in to see your operation. Maybe they'll do a story about, how things are work. Maybe you've got new voting equipment, or just, to try and answer some of the questions that their listeners might have. And then you've developed that relationship, and they're more apt to have, do stories about things with your perspective in it, if you've already got that relationship developed. So I would and again, a lot of these stations are looking for locally generated content. And if you can help provide that, that will go a long way to getting your message out, and think about the fact that they want sound, especially if it's a public radio station, they want sound. So if you can think of interesting sounds in your office, maybe it's just a poll worker training class, or it's installing new equipment, or it's, showing how a Dropbox works, that type of thing. That would be very helpful.
The fun kind of, I don't know, is it B-roll if it's sound, Pam? I'm not sure.
I've never heard that. Yeah.
The sound of ballot sorters. I know we talked to Haley Watkins from King County for the guide, and like any election official, and I think most folks, like, they hear that sound and they immediately associate it with a process in the elections process. And I think, to some of Pam's points, communicating or providing information in a way that doesn't require too many leaps for the person on the receiving end, meaning the journalist, right? So if I'm a journalist, I've got my sound to accompany my piece. I've got some ideas for how to do this. I think, given the ecosystem that they're operating in as well, like, to the extent that you can make it easy for them, the more likely you are to get their attention and get them to tell your story.
I think they call it, on the TV side at least, it's SOT, sound on tape. This isn't a radio story, but we had a TV news story last year on our election security, and they came in our office and they were filming, like, where we store our ballots, and they love the sound that our old 1920s era vault door made when we closed it and latched it and locked it. And they recorded us, like, shutting the door 5 times so they get that sound they could use in their video package. But that works great on radio as well. And by the way, that vault is like 3 feet thick. If the missiles ever start flying, I'm gonna go hide in that vault. That's exactly the kind of sounds that do make a good and entertaining radio package for the stations that know what they're doing.
Right, and it can even be the sound of people too. So I think of one story where I was in a county election office in Pennsylvania, and this was actually during COVID, or a little bit after the height of COVID. And they were getting inundated with mail-in ballots. So I was in the where they were receiving all the mail ballots, and just the sound of them dumping them, the volunteers opening up the mail ballots, and just slicing things open. So just that type, and the people working there sort of exclaiming about, oh my gosh, look at this, look at that, look at how many bundles of mail we have. There's just so much about the sort of human effort of running elections that really appeals to people, and people want to hear it. And you should think about that in terms of how will this sound? How would this sound to the average listener? Or as I like to say, you think of these people, the people who are the audiences of radio programs are the people, your family members or the people down the street from you. You are trying to communicate with your voters and individual people.
Perfect. Thank you. I do want to talk a little bit, or have you all talk a little bit about creating content for radio. So specifically about writing style, how should folks approach this when they start thinking like, hey, I want to actually put something on the radio?
Do you want me to start, or?
Please, please, please.
This is what I did for 28 years. No. I mean, it does depend very much on what you're doing, right? Whether it's an ad, it's completely different for whether you are trying to produce or help produce an ad. And I think I'll let TJ and Nick maybe talk a little bit more about that, since that's not really anything that I did. If you are going to be or have been invited to be a guest on a radio news show or a panel, as Nick referred to, that's sort of different than when you just have an interview, or if you are, again, trying to help develop a story for a reporter. The one thing that goes through most of these things, especially if you are talking on a panel or you're being interviewed by a reporter, is to try and think first, what is the message you want to get across? What is the main point you want to get across? And for radio, what's different for radio than for print is you really can only get across one or two, maybe tops 3 points, right? Otherwise, it just becomes too muddled, too complicated. You are trying to appeal to listeners who are, are bombarded with information. So you're trying to get to the main point. You need to be very succinct. You need to talk in very, basically short sentences, right to the point. Don't use jargon at all if you can avoid it. Even avoid using a lot of numbers if possible, because for the listener, those things just kind of go in one ear and out the other, and they're just going to stop listening if you become too complicated. Like you might be stopping to listening to me now because I'm talking too much. But so you really want to be direct, and you want to be sincere. I mean, you want to be like, again, that you are talking to another human being. You're not just talking to this reporter, you are talking, think of somebody that you are trying to get this message, an individual human being that you are trying to communicate with. And I always think back, when I first started at NPR and I was an editor, and I was just kind of learning the whole process. One of the best reporters there told me that when she went into the studio to record her pieces, she would always put a photo of her husband in the studio on the desk next to her, and so she would be talking to him. So it would sound sincere, real, and direct. You should think about that. So I often would think about an individual that I was trying to talk to when I would do my radio pieces, to try and get that more conversational feel.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. It's a completely different writing style. Like if you're writing a PSA and you're sending, maybe off to a production company to put together, or you maybe even sending it directly to the radio station, and they're gonna put it together and put it in the air for you. Read it out loud. Read it out loud multiple times, in different pacing, different voices. It's not the same as writing a press release for print purposes when you want them to pull out a few quotes. You're writing something that is going to be played in a 30-second spot or whatever, and you want it to make sure when it fits in that 30 seconds without having to get too fast. But also, that it is clear and it drives home the points you want to drive home in a conversational way. And if you're doing prep for that, listen to radio and listen to the top of the hour local news and how they package and frame their stories and how it's sometimes 10 or 15 seconds and they're jumping on to the next news bit. That's all you're going to get in a lot of cases, whether they're taking snippets from a press release or they're going to be running a PSA for you, or you're even going to be talking to a reporter for a couple of minutes that's going to be using it for an interview in a news story. No matter what, you want to make sure you have that conversational tone and make sure you practice it in advance and you kind of know what to craft it in a certain way. Now the bigger election offices, you're going to have communications experts working for you that kind of know how to do that anyway, but most of us don't have that. I've got 60,000 voters. I'm our communications director as well as our registrar, so it's anything that's coming out from our office is coming from me, and that's usually the tact that I'll use is I'll read it out loud. I'll read it even to my staff here before I send it out and say, all right, does this sound good? Let's tweak a couple of those lines.
And I think in terms of, Nick mentioned 30-second spots, remembering that when it comes to ad placement, usually radio stations are pretty regimented. They've got 15-second, 30-second, minute-long spots. You are slotting in. You're not, you need to be mindful of that. So 15 seconds is 40 words. 30 seconds is about 80 words. A minute is 160 words. And as you're writing, understanding that the writing style is a little different in that, like, if you were to say www.cranston.gov, that's not one word. That's like 7 words. I think it's 7 words because you've got to count each W. You've got to count the dots. Those are, as you're speaking, that takes time. I mean, it's intuitive once you think about it, but when you're jumping into writing for radio, it does take a second to realize, oh, this takes a lot longer to communicate or to just speak verbally than it does to read.
Yeah, and one other thing, when you're listening to radio, unlike the newspaper or anything that you're reading, or even seeing on social media, you can go, the audience can always go back and see if they missed something, or something was confusing, they can go back and say, okay, what were they talking about? Or what was that number that they were mentioning? But in radio, it's gone, right? You have one shot at talking to her. You can't go back and say, and the listener hears it once and then you're moving on. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's why you want to be so clear and not use, you basically have one shot at their brain and you should use it as succinctly and clearly as you can.
Perfect. I've placed a link in the chat for our using radio tip sheet. And it also breaks this information down for folks who are at home. So it has information about the paid ads versus PSAs, if there are any additional questions on that. And then there is a really good example at the bottom where it shows text for a press release and then also shows how that was rewritten for radio. Just in case, we're talking to you today and you're trying to take notes, we have this all in a guide. So we placed a link to that guide in the chat as well. But thank you all. Looks like the next thing that we want to talk about is, we've kind of talked about it a little bit, is the way that we're communicating with folks. No matter what platform that we're using, that we're staying consistent, our messaging is the same. We're not telling people different dates on different platforms. So I think this question kind of comes down to how can election officials make sure that all of their communications tools are working together? So how can radio fit into what they're already doing on social media? How can it fit into what they're doing on, if they're going on podcasts? We kind of talked about that in the beginning as well. Any other interviews that they may have? And TJ, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, I would just generally say that having a plan, and recognizing, I think, to some of the points that have previously been made, you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time, right? Like what you write for one audience or for one medium with a little bit of tweaking will probably work just fine for another one. But I think it's just being intentional that, again, going back to that idea, this is just one tool in the bigger toolbox. Make sure you're using all of those tools, and make sure you're ensuring that the information that you're sharing on one is the same as on the other. uh, that's just a matter of paying attention, having a plan, and being intentional.
Yeah, you want to be consistent across the board. But keep in mind too that, you can reinforce some concepts with radio, especially with the longer form sort of talk radio. And then sometimes you're going to be, and I'd say not more than sometimes, many times you're going to be reaching what could be considered conservative audience with talk radio that might be very skeptical about elections, might be very skeptical about election integrity issues. Here in Rhode Island, we've got a pretty dominant local AM talk radio station that has a large reach, but it's a very conservative audience. And multiple hosts on that station will call up myself, call up our Secretary of State, call up the Rhode Island Board of Elections to try and get people to go on and talk about election integrity issues, because that's what they're talking about sometimes for 3 or 4 or 5 hours in a day. So we'll go on and we'll tell our side, we'll tell exactly what our procedures are. And I think, because we're willing to engage, we're willing to have those, direct and frank conversations about our processes in such a conversational way, we reach a lot of people, and I think we convince a lot of people that our elections have integrity by doing that. Now, obviously, once we're off, the conversation continues. The callers come in. You still hear some people coming on. Oh, that's nonsense. That's conspiracy. Whatever they're talking about. But we engage. We're willing to do that because, for one, it's easy. It's easy to talk about what we do because we do it all day long. But again, it's also free. I mean, in order to do that via most other forms of media, we're talking about, let's say, a direct mailer about election integrity. We're not going to be able to do that. We don't have the funds for that. But to get on for an hour and reach 40,000 people, that's huge. Whether it's myself doing it on behalf of the city, I'm actually reaching a statewide audience on that particular station when I do that, or a Secretary of State going and doing the same thing. And then sometimes you'll take calls, and sometimes, it'll get a little off the rails, but, once you do it a couple of times, it becomes easier. It's not something to be, afraid of. And it's a natural way to communicate about elections and election processes that we really don't have a lot of opportunity to do in other platforms. Unless we're doing something ourselves, like hosting our own YouTube channel, which, it's a good idea, but a lot of us don't have the time to do.
The only thing I'd add is that no matter what you're doing in terms of your communication strategy, when you're working with the media, obviously every market is a little different, every community is a little different. So if you have time, as much as possible, I would suggest sort of reaching out to those different media platforms, those different organizations in your community, and say, what do you need? What can we do to help you get this information out to your audiences? And it might differ from different places, but I would definitely make that part of my overall communication strategy.
Great, thank you all. While you all were chatting, I put a few more resources into the chat as well for everybody here. It looks like VoterCast also has a few resources for writing out PSAs. So I put a link to VoterCast in the chat as well if folks want to check that out. And then we also have created an online course that was based off of the tip sheet that I also placed into the chat as well. If election officials are really interested in enrolling in that online course as a part of our election learning lab, learning more, going step by step through the PSA writing stages and things like that, that is a resource for all of you as well. I think that we've reached the end of our questions, but we do have folks who've placed some questions in the Q&A feature. So the first question that we have is, if radio/audio media market is shared by multiple county election offices, how can you target messaging to your voters and protect them against getting confused by information from a neighboring county with different operations, such as different hours for early in-person voting, and things like that.
I'll jump right on this one because this is something we deal with all the time. Rhode Island is a state that's covered by three television stations, and our TV station market crosses into southeastern Massachusetts all the way out to almost Cape Cod. So every time Massachusetts has an election, and their primary is usually a week before our statewide primary, we are inundated with calls in our office because on the morning news, they say, and on radio as well, they hear or they see voters going to the polls today. We'll tell you more up next. Well, and then they call us and then, well, why is my polling place closed? I went to the school and then the kids were there. Like, well, for one, we don't have an election today in Rhode Island. That ours is next week. And it happens with special elections all the time too. So that's always a challenge because and that's not a challenge created by election officials. It's a challenge created by the news media not being specific in their teases before they actually get into the story. But when it comes to what election officials themselves can actually do about that, Rhode Island is a little fortunate. We have very consistent laws statewide. And a lot of states are similar. I mean, we have uniform polling place opening and polling place closing hours in Rhode Island. 7 a.m. we open, 8 p.m. we close. So if I am going on those statewide radio stations, I'm pretty much only going to talk about things that with good reason that are consistent statewide. Or I'll even mention I'll when we talk about our early voting location, for example, Cranston has an off-site early voting location. 30 of the other cities and towns in Rhode Island have their early voting at their city or town hall. Initially, when we started doing early voting a few years ago in the state board elections, the Secretary of State were putting out messaging and marketing saying, yeah, go to your city or town hall for early voting. And of course, we were one of only two at the time that did not have early voting at city or town hall. And we have almost 10% of the state's population and voters. So we were getting very upset that their messaging was inconsistent in that regard. So I would even go on the radio and say, oh, by the way, go to your city and town hall to vote early, except for in Cranston, of course, where we're off-site at our other location down the road and give out the address. You can craft your message and say it pretty quickly to kind of gear those differences and make sure you point them out for voters. But for the most part, it's helpful that if you focus on things that are consistent, especially these days, you've got a lot of high wattage radio stations that are going to cross many county lines or many jurisdictional lines, and you want to basically tailor your message to be something that's more generic and less specific to you don't tell people that just your own county voting locations or your own county website. Give them something that they can use to know your audience. Basically, give them something they can use to access the information in their county too, even though you're there for the purposes of serving your own voters.
And I'd add on the topic of like writing out a public service announcement or doing an ad, giving some of your words to, this is a message from the Tangerine County Registrar of Voters. And then maybe at the end, for information on your county, go to some generic website or go to their website. That's if you're doing something specifically for you as an office. I think the idea of like regional collaboration to ensure that, to Nick's point, whatever information is consistent across jurisdictions, you're able to kind of share that as a unified voice. That's a great way of doing it. But I don't know if it's a problem that will ever be entirely overcome, just because of the nature of how folks consume this information.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is that, Nick was mentioning having teasers sometimes that say, oh, primaries are today, and they're not. They aren't in your community. That's something that I would reach out to the local media. That's why it's so important to have these connections established in advance so that you can reach out to the local media and explain that is a big problem when they say things like that, because for the most part, most news organizations want to know that, and hopefully that will correct itself in the future. Not always, but sometimes.
All right, looks like our next question or maybe comment is one suggestion for government agencies is to contact your state broadcast association. We live in Minnesota, and I know other states as well have partnered with them for radio space or radio ad space. That is kind of a hybrid of a PSA and a paid ad. It looks like they found it very worthwhile in Minnesota. Can each of you speak a little bit to that and what that might look like for folks on our call?
Yeah, I think just generally, once you're kind of in the Rolodex of some of these folks, whether you're doing it through partnerships with statewide organizations like what was mentioned in the Q&A, or just with the account manager that you deal with at your local radio station or selection of radio stations, you do become part of their, like, they think about you, right? You may place an ad, but they may also have a news show where they talk about elections, and having you as someone that they're familiar with one way or another or through whatever means just makes it all the more likely that they're going to reach out to you for the official information, get you to come on, talk, and do those types of things.
Nick, Pam, do you have anything to add?
No, I'll agree with everything TJ said. I mean, and Pam mentioned it really a lot earlier too, but to drive home the point, that collaboration, that establishing those relationships and ties with your radio contacts, whether it's in the marketing department or it's in their news department if they have one still. That's going to be very helpful in a lot of ways, because once you establish those connections, they are going to come back to you for content. It's not going to be you having to write press releases or kind of pitch them, or hey, give me an hour, this week on one of the afternoon drive shows. So they're going to come to you more often because they know that you're someone that is an expert in the field that also can talk about something that's very topical on the minds of people, especially as you get closer to election day. And obviously that's usually when you're at your busiest. So, but it's still worth it. It's still, worth staying late an extra hour that night to finish the work you couldn't do during the day because you were doing a radio interview. If you're a week out to an election, that's when people are starting to pay attention. That's when you want to connect with people. And if you have those established relationships with your local radio stations, it's just going to be so much easier to engage with them and for them to reach out and engage with you. And that's something you want. That's something you should try and have as part of your overall office's communication strategy. Again, we've been stressing this the entire panel. It's one part of your communication strategy, but it could be a bigger part than you think if you're not currently using it right now. I was on the radio last year for to talk about our post-election auditing process. That was the topic of the day in election certification. And it seems like a pretty dry topic, but it was actually pretty engaging interview and an engaging 3-hour segment when they took the calls after. And I had to go inspect the polling location afterwards. So I was in my car and I had to stop at a gas station, fill up the gas tank. And there I am filling my gas tank, and somebody says, "Hey, I just heard you on the radio. Sounded great." Like, how did this guy recognize me from the radio? Like, I didn't talk, I didn't say anything. That's kind of scary. It's
You got
the election official plaque on my car. That's how I knew.
You got to stop
I'm
talking
telling
to
you,
the.
I'm sorry.
You got to stop talking to the gas pump, Nick.
I'm telling you, that's it's amazing the impact that radio has. That's really, I mean, for this particular question, I guess the only thing I would mention, and I know it's really hard, but we talked about keeping these connections and reaching out and having a personal connection with the local media station. Just like election offices, media stations, personnel, there's a lot of turnover. So the person you may be your best contact last year is not going to be your best contact next year. So unfortunately, you do have to kind of keep on top of that as well.
And I know that this was brought up, and this is a little bit outside of the question, but the value of always picking up the phone is so huge. I remember in my own experience, I'm sure that there were many interviews or opportunities that we got to share information simply because somebody was in a bind. Oh darn, I need a story, I need to do something. Who can I call? Oh, that guy at the elections office, he always answers on the first or second ring. Let's call him. Like I really can't overstate like being quick in terms of getting back to folks, answering on that first ring if you can, and just making sure that it's something that you prioritize.
Yeah, and if you don't know the answer to the question that they have, first of all, admit it, and then say, either that you're going to try and find out the answer and we'll get back to them, or that maybe suggest somebody else that they could talk to who
Mhm.
would have the answer. But not picking up the phone because you also don't know what's going on is not necessarily the best strategy.
Yeah, and that's something, just going back to my own experience, uh, to Pam's point, always being willing to not just mention, oh, you may talk to so and so at this place, but actually like going through the trouble of finding their phone number, connecting them via email. Um, People, I think Pam can say it better than I can, but I think folks in the media really appreciated that as a practice, and we're more likely to come back, and we were more likely to be able to share information because of that little bit of extra effort.
Yeah, definitely. And because a lot, especially if you're talking about a news department at a radio station, they're on deadline, and some of these reporters, they don't just cover elections, they cover 25 other things, and they're out reporting all these different things, and sometimes something happens and they need to know immediately and they have to be on the air in 10 minutes, and really are very thankful for whatever help they can get.
As you all were talking, it reminded me of another guide that you wrote for us, Pam, called Telling Our Story, which is an elections communications guide. I think it was created back in 2022, but everything in it is still relevant and prevalent as ever before. There are tips on connecting with reporters, keeping the lines of communications open, making sure that you're responding to them within a timely manner, introducing yourself as an election official, just really, really beneficial stuff. So I also put a link to that guide into the chat for today's webinar as well, because I think that they go hand in hand, as we're talking about your larger communication strategy. So perfect. Well, it looks like I'm going to give folks, we have a couple more minutes. I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to place a question into the Q&A if they have one. So we'll give folks maybe 30 seconds or so to do that before we wrap up today. But thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I don't see anything coming through. Well, perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I just add one thing? And this is about
Absolutely.
any audio that you do. I mean, there's something about the human voice that is, it's sort of another level of communication, just the sound of your voice. So that whatever you're doing, whether you're talking to just a reporter, whether you're doing an ad, whether you're on a panel, you are communicating your enthusiasm for for elections, for the work that you're doing, or your sincerity. There's just some incredible value to that voice that you do not get in any other medium. Yeah, even television, it's kind of hard because you're kind of distracted by the visuals. But the voice is very, very important. And if you are trying to reach people, use that voice.
Well, to that point, Pam, I think it's so much more easy to get comfortable in a radio setting, right? You're not thinking, oh, what do I look like? Oh my goodness. I in the guide that we did, or the tip sheet that we have, Nick, we have a recording of you talking to probably one of the radio hosts that you mentioned today, and you can hear the sincerity. You can also, you mentioned, I think you guys had at that point the second highest early voting turnout. You could hear in your voice like the how you were jesting or joking with your fellow jurisdiction. I just think that all of those things add up really nicely to convey the honesty, the sincerity, and all of those things really effectively, and without the stress of, oh my goodness, I'm going to be on TV. What is this going to look like, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's that human connection, right? That's, you can't get that in a rote press release. You can't get that even in a TV news stand-up. It's gonna be hard to convey that. But in a radio, yeah, you have that, more of a leeway in that kind of format. Especially if it's a host who's not gonna play gotcha. I mean, there's gonna be some talk show hosts or talk radio hosts out there that you might want to either stay away from or be careful with, because they might ask you some loaded questions. But even then, if you're well prepared, then you can be effective. Now, I can go on, I can pick up the phone right now and do an interview on how to set up a polling place, do early voting, and those things I can do in my sleep. But there are parts of my job, parts of the election process, that I would do a lot more prep for before going on the radio. I would spend, an hour or two, reviewing my materials, reviewing our procedures to make sure I don't say the wrong thing, to make sure that, I've got my own facts right before I go on and start answering questions live on the air. Or if I don't know the answer live on the air, I'll say, well, I'll get back to you on that. But preparation, I think, is also very important if you're going to wade into that talk radio medium, and just make sure that you know what you're talking about before you go in the air. Don't be afraid. You don't have to be fearful. It is going to be conversational. You are going to have an opportunity, for the most part, to defend whatever it is you're saying and elaborate what you're saying. You're not talking about 10-second sound bites. You're talking about 2-3 minute segments for each question that you're asked. And that's a lot of time and plenty of time, really, to make a case, and then the audience can make their own judgments.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. That was a great way to wrap up this conversation. Thank you to TJ for putting this all together. It was really, really helpful and interesting. And thank you to everyone at home for joining us today. This was a great discussion. All of the resources that we mentioned in today's chat have been placed into the chat. And as always, our inbox is open. If you have any additional questions or would like to be connected with anyone, please email us at support@electionsgroup.com. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.